I reckon that in my 3 years of active service with the 9th Battery, half my time was spent in and about the Vimy Ridge.
Vimy Ridge itself is a long stretch that commands the valley of the Scarpe between Lens and Arras, and at its highest point is about 475 feet above sea level. Since the Germans occupied the heights, they had a perfect view of our trenches, which made it impossible for any daylight movement overland. Of course, as we lay at the foot of this slope, our field glasses showed us everything that was ahead of us, and I knew long before I went over the ground every object there, this broken wheel and this gun carriage and so on, so that when the time came to go over, we weren't stumbling into unknown territory.
The Hun was above us, and any streams ran into us, and the trenches were full of water. Then it froze. Everything froze, and snow on the ground. Then the thaw came, and everything just fell in.
The communication trench was above your knees in mud, and of course greatcoats coming down halfway between your knees and your ankle gathered up mud, and it would get on there 2 and 3 inches thick, and it would be awful heavy. And we just took our jackknives and hacked them off into shorter coats to keep them out of the mud. I well remember I was one of them, and I was fined $1 for destroying government property.
The line at Vimy Ridge consisted more or less of a section of mine craters where the line had been blown up, and the Germans were on one side of the crater and we were on the other.
Well, our outpost line were all on the lips of these craters. You could hear the sentries talking in the German line. I remember one fellow telling me, the fellow opposite me, he says, has got a terrible cold. He said, I'm making it worse because I've shot holes in his dipper so that he can't bail it, and he's standing in water to his knees.
The Vimy line had been very quiet until the Canadians got there. And then, as usual, we immediately started stirring up trouble.
The French had held these trenches, and they were nice. And there were printed orders on little chunks of board on the support trenches. And these orders were that in the case of attack, all the outposts were to withdraw, and the support trench would be the line of defense. And the first day we were there, these were all torn off and replaced with orders that, in case of attack, the line of defense were the outpost line.
Nearly every time we were in, we made a little raid. And the Germans never raided us once. We believe they tried it one night. We saw a man stand up in the wire, but nobody ever got in our trench.
There was a great deal of tunneling going on, and a great deal of blasting. This meant that the man out on sentry go didn't know whether the enemy were right under his feet blasting or whether it was our own blasting. It was a very, very trying time for the men on sentry go.
You'd be sitting there, innocent as anything, you know, in the trench, and all of a sudden, that was it. The whole front, maybe 1,000 yards of trench would go up, just blowing sky high thing.
You could hear the shrieks when the thing blew up and they were just buried in it. Then we consolidated the lip of the crater.
They had tunneled Vimy Ridge from one end to the other, and in these tunnels, it was just like an underground city. Rooms were dug out, medical rooms, orderly rooms, sleeping quarters, and the part the 78th were in was what is known as Blue Ball Tunnel. There's a little miniature railroad down there, or narrow gauge railroad, right from one end to the other, and it carries supplies on, and every 50 to 100 yards there'd be a stairway up to the trench above. And this preparation had been going on all winter to get ready for this one final push.
Vimy was a very important tactical feature, important from the point of view of defense, and also very important to the Germans from the point of view of observation, because we could do nothing in our area without being seen by daylight. And therefore, it was a place that had to be held. Consequently, they had developed every known form of fortification. Good trenches, tunnels, caves, and very heavy wire. The French had attacked it twice unsuccessfully, and it was considered to be an extremely difficult operation. As a matter of fact, I was told at the time that the French said that the Canadians could never capture Vimy Ridge by the method adopted.
A German officer was captured on a raid, and he said, "We know you're going to attack Vimy Ridge. We know all about your plans." He says, "You might get to the top of Vimy Ridge, but," he said, "I'll tell you this, you'll be able to take all the Canadians back to Canada in a rowboat that get there." Fortunately for us, he was wrong.
Vimy was planned months before, and we spent the whole winter of 1617 in the Vimy area. We knew the territory. We could look up and see that low ridge all the time, and we were taken out of the line, and tapes were laid down representing the trenches, and we were rehearsed over and over again for the taking of the ridge.
All the German trenches were laid out in tape, and we did our training over those tapes. They are mock-ups of the actual German trenches.
Every time the battalion was out of the line and in support or reserve 5 or 6 miles behind the line, we were practicing on the tapes, and every battalion and every company and every platoon was allocated to a certain section of the German trench.
It even got so that if every officer was knocked out, the non-commissioned officers would know what to do. For instance, we'd go out today, we'd practice the attack, and the colonel would say, "Oh, so many officers have been knocked out," and you'd find perhaps a sergeant taking command of a company. And it got so that every man knew exactly what he had to do.
We had it arranged and rearranged right down to the point where if every officer and every NCO had been killed, the privates in different sections had been trained to take over.
We were an entirely different army than at the Somme. And I suppose that some of the terrible things that happened at the Somme were of some benefit in turning out the type of army that we had at Vimy. We had mastered our job. I think that's the basis of the whole show. Training, training, training. Master that gun, master that gun. And I remember every time that we were out from the line, as Lewis Gun Sergeant, I had classes going all the time on Lewis guns, even with a bunch of old-timers. We used to say that our gunners got so good, you know, that they could disassemble the gun and put it in a scoop shovel and throw it in the air, and it would come down assembled and shoot.
We were good in every department. We were up to strength. We had adequate preparation. We had adequate reconnaissance. And we knew what we were going to do, and we did it.
The infantry were briefed much more on what the artillery were going to do. The artillery were briefed much more on where the infantry expected to get. And there were better arrangements for getting FOs forward.
I can remember on a sunny spring day going over a little valley to Hurradell Ridge and watching the fire of the artillery. This was a continuous, persistent process. It was going on all the time.
The only thing wrong with the Vimy attack was that to capture this position, we had to cut the wire. It was quite impossible to attack without getting rid of that wire. Therefore, there was no surprise. You couldn't cut the wire without using artillery. And that bombardment went on for about 3 weeks. Well, the only thing that we could surprise them was on the date.
There was a mass of artillery coming in. I think it was said that if every gun behind Vimy Ridge was placed wheel to wheel, there'd be no space left. We were observing by balloon, mostly, because it was considered the most accurate observation you could get. And we had our guns pretty well pinpointed for our targets a week before the battle started.
We used to fire nearly 100 rounds a gun per day to cut the wire. We had that much ammunition.
We had aerial observation and also patrols. Patrols would go out from time to time to report on how it was to get on. Then, of course, it's our job at night to prevent them repairing the wire. The units holding the line had to see that any wiring party was discovered and fired upon and driven in. That's part of the frontline duty.
We did a raid on the morning of the 8th of April to examine the wire in front of us. The ground observation had said the wire was cut. The air reconnaissance reported the wire was heavy, but they couldn't come down close enough to see because it was on the apex of the ridge. So Sir Arthur Currie personally came up and suggested we should find out. So we put over the raid on the morning of the 8th, and we reported it wasn't cut. The ground observers couldn't see it. And the wire on either side of us had been cut. But these craters threw up lips. They couldn't see the wire. And then the trench was cleared for 1,000 yards, each side of our front, and back for 400. Then Sir Arthur Currie turned the whole artillery onto it and cleaned it up. And when we went over on the morning of the 9th, the wire was no obstacle. But that was Sir Arthur's own personal attention to that. We would have been ready to go over as it was.
As usual, it was pitch dark, pouring rain, and Germans were very nervous and were shelling very heavily as we went forward from the music hall line down across Zouave Valley and entered the tunnels under the ridge. The battalion going up to the attacking trenches went up in the normal way.
We were all in these huge tunnels, and we were sitting on the ground there with our backs up against the wall and trying to make ourselves feel comfortable, or giving each other company, I guess, mostly. And the commanding officer, he came along and he looked at me and he says, "Drummer, come with me." And I followed him out into the trenches, and he visited every man that was out there in that front line. He went right down the line, and that was the last tour he made before the big scrap next morning.
In our sector, there were no tunnels, so we were concentrated in old trenches, old dugouts, any shelter we could find. Just before dawn, before 0 hour, I went out, and the area was absolutely deserted.
We took our position in this trench, and then we waited. Everything was quiet. There wasn't a sound, you know. We all had our watches, and we knew what time the bombardment was supposed to start, but when it was 2 or 3 minutes from the time, it seemed a long time before it did happen then even, you know.
From 1 o'clock until 5:30, thousands of men, quiet. The locking ring on a bayonet was a little loose. When the order to fix bayonets went along the line, you'd think there was 1,000 bees humming, the trembling, waiting. During the night, while we were waiting in the jumping off place, they took all our light artillery out of the gun pits and manhandled them right up behind us. And when they opened up, it split your eardrums. You just couldn't hear a thing. You could just hear one continual roar of the guns. It's just a drum fire. It's just a steady roar.
It was just like a continuous sheet of lightning, like a prairie fire behind us. It was utterly dark still, pitch black. You could hear this tremendous swish of the shells overhead, and then just a continuous crash along the line. This was the most spectacular fireworks I ever saw or ever hoped to see.
We were dancing a macabre dance as our nerves just vibrated to the thousands of shells and the millions of machine gun bullets that were whizzing over. I felt that if I had put my finger up, I should have touched a ceiling of sound, because sound had acquired a new quality, a quality of solidity. It really was indescribable. It wiped out any fear that might have been lingering in us.
The nerve strain in an attack like Vimy ends when you're away.
When we started over at 7:30 in the morning, they still had a 5-9 barrage on our old front line, and it looked as though our battalion would have to go through it. It stopped just as we got there. That was counter battery work that did that stopped it, and how. Well, then from then on, there was relatively little shelling. We just outgunned him so much that he didn't have a chance of coming back.
They were piling the gunfire ahead of us, plowing up everything ahead of you. A rat couldn't live on that ridge. Previously, we bombarded for weeks ahead, and finally on the day of attack, there'd be a long bombardment of 3 or 4 hours. The Germans would immediately retire into their dugouts, wait till the bombardment lifted, then come out. But in Vimy, immediately the bombardment opened, the troops followed on the heels of the barrage. The barrage lifted almost immediately and went on. The Germans were down in their dugouts. Of course, they weren't expecting the assaulting troops for 2 or 3 hours yet. Well, the troops were right on top of them.
And that front line of his was just dancing with exploding shells, and we were advancing there that morning. And we'd advance to within 50 yards of that and wait a few seconds till it had lifted. It was timed. And they'd lift
and fire on the next line, and we'd advance again.
We felt so safe in front of that rolling barrage, you could see the thing beating. It was just like a lawnmower, you know, when you're cutting grass. They just simply give us wonderful fire.
Brutinel's idea was that these machine guns, they first gave this great supporting fire. That fire kept up, you see, way over our heads, which got us over there. And when you got to your objectives, he had another wave of machine guns moving forward to take positions behind you, giving you continuous support all the way up, and particularly on the flanks.
The machine gun detachments moved generally on the time scheduled for the infantry. In fact, in some cases, they were way ahead of the infantry.
The machine gun fire was so thick and heavy and persistent that I saw balls of barbed wire rolled up and beaten as hard as iron.
The whole thing was flattened. I looked back, and it put me in mind of an anthill. As far as I could see, it was just alive with glittering bayonets, and boy, did I have courage. And I said, oh, what support I got. I'm all right. But before that, I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only one in the world there. But when that started, boy, my chest stuck out.
Just before we went over the top, it started to rain and snow. And by the time we got halfway over to where we were going, we were up to our knees in mud. And we lost about 50% of our men on Vimy Ridge, but we lost the most of them in the first half mile.
We waited until we could see the barrage lift, then we went over. And we were around some craters.
That's where we lost all the men. We lost over 100 killed going from our trench to the first line of the German trench. Machine guns.
My brother, whom I lost at Vimy, was just a very few feet from me when I lost him, actually. He was wounded first, and I dropped into the shell hole to give him first aid. And after giving him first aid, I left him. Of course, I couldn't stay. And apparently, he raised up in the shell hole to watch me, see where I went. And I heard the shot fired and heard it land and turned around to see him fall. I got back to him a second time, he was gone. And of course, I couldn't stay. And I went forward with my troops. But there was always a doubt in my mind that in the heat of battle, I may have been mistaken, that maybe he hadn't been killed. And that probably at some future time he might show up. I always had that on my mind for a long, long time.
I got my men out in a big shell hole out in no man's land, and we were to look for a dugout with a flag or something over the entrance. And I said, I'll go out along here and see if I can see any sign of it. You fellas stay here. So I walked along foolishly along the middle of no man's land, and there were 3 or 4 shells dropped behind me, and the boys thought I was smashed to pieces. The corporal had seen this flag, and he took the rest of the men to this dugout. I finally saw it and got to the top of this dugout, and I could hear the boys talking down below. Poor old Secord, he got it. Yes, and the son of a gun had the rum ration with him. So just then I appeared and said, all right, boys, I'm here with your rum rations. 3 cheers.
All that ground was full of German dugouts. And we come to a dugout, we just throw 3 or 4 Mills bombs down into them and carry on.
I remember one fellow standing at the top throwing bombs down and saying, come out, you sons of bitches. And every time a man would come up, he'd demand his watch. He had about 20 watches.
It's a marvelous system of deep dugouts. And if all those men had been up above doing the duty, then a few of us would have been here today.
Any Germans who had been up were dead. Nothing living could have survived on top. The artillery did everything it said it would do, and I could hardly put my hand on the ground without seeing where shrapnel had gone in.
The first dugout we got to was all partly blown in, but you could crawl down there. And I could hear them down there, you know. Down goes a bomb. Nope, no, nobody coming up there, so away we go to another one. Finally, I come to one, and the guys are pretty near the top. I ended up with 35 prisoners. Some in their stocking feet, some in underwear, some with no shoes and socks, and some in the high boots they had. Others with only a coat, and the odd one had a blanket. They were just knocked out of bed.
The 7th Battalion objective was this famous German trench called Augsburger Trench. And right in front of it was the 9 Elms. And when we got to this Augsburger Trench, we pulled 150 prisoners out of there. They come out with their hands up. Behind it was a dip, and then you started to climb at these 9 Elms, and then you swung off to the left to the village of Thelis. Further over, right on the edge of the ridge, was the village of Farbus. Well, when we got through to the Nine Elms, the 1st Brigade went through us, and they went right through to Farbus.
Once the show started, every man was actually his own general. I tagged myself onto a well-known sergeant, Sergeant Swanby. And we sailed through, and halfway up, the barrage stopped. Everybody's supposed to stop and wait till it started again. But Sergeant Swanby and the rest of us were so enthused, we kept right on going. And we were down the front of that ridge. We engaged 8 Jerrys. They gave us a bad time, and we give them a bad time. But it ended up, the Sergeant Swanby and I were the only 2 alive. And we could see the barrage coming. We could see the whiz-bangs, thick as hair on a dog. And a piece of shrapnel hit Sergeant Swanby in the shoulder. And I'm the only one that came out of there unscathed.
We had gone about, not more than a third of a mile, and I was knocked unconscious through being struck in the backside by the flat piece of a shell. When I recovered consciousness, I then caught up with the line again and came face to face with German resistance, hand-to-hand fighting. I fired the 8 shots in my revolver, point blank, and they were hurling potato mashers at us. One hit my helmet and exploded on my back. And George Kilpatrick, who was our padre, came out and said, well, they've got you at last, Eric. Can you make home? And I said, well, I've got to try. And he said, well, the fire's very, very bad. And I found another chap who was wounded, who was coming in too. And in another shell hole, we had another small German who we picked up and brought in between the 2 of us. And on the way in to evidence the fire, this boy was killed right under our noses, walking in between myself and this other chap. He was dead before he hit the ground.
I had the feeling that I was taking great 7-foot steps and going over the ground without any effort at all, because my left temporal artery had been cut, and I was so lightheaded that while I was stumbling over the muck, I had the sensation of walking over the top of everything. And I felt hilarious. I wanted to laugh and talk to the men that were coming up to reinforce. And I asked one for a drink of rum, and he looked at my wound. No, nothing doing. And I didn't know where I was. Our artillery and his had cut up the ground so there was nothing left to identify it. But I saw a piece of wood, white painted wood, sticking out of the mud, and I took it out and wiped it on my pants, and it said on it, Ross Street. That was the point from which we had started that morning before dawn. In the 2 minutes I was in the medical trench. I sat down. The medical sergeant came up every few minutes, and he'd pick someone out and come, and he picked me out. He and I reached the door of the medical dugout. We were just stepping down when we heard this shell coming. It sounded like a freight train moving through the sky. And when it had exploded, we looked back, and where I had been sitting with 6 other men, there was nothing but tatters of uniforms and bits of men. So I went through the thing and back out, and I was stumbling along, still happy, still completely punch-drunk, and I found a blind Japanese who was not a 2nd CMR, but he was a Canadian. And by that time I was getting very weak. So he was very strong, but he couldn't see. I hope he later recovered his sight. I think possibly it was temporary. And he gave me the support, and I gave him the eyes till we got out to Mount St. Eloy, and I just had no sensation in my knees. They had turned to rubber, and I just clattered down on the cobblestones, absolutely inert, like a fish suddenly flung out of a stream.
I was sent up to go up to Hero Wood and see whether that area was occupied by us. And I got to where I thought it should be in the map, and I couldn't see anything. Turned out after there wasn't anything. With our bombardment, even the stumps had gone. Nearest woods I could see was Farbus Woods. And at this stage, it was very, very quiet, as frequently happened after an attack. I walked over the top into Farbus Woods. Then I realized as soon as I got there that I had the wrong wood. I also realized that Farbus Wood hadn't yet been taken.